Welcome to Authentic Educators, a podcast by teachers for teachers about best lessons, favorite classroom moments, and strategies you can implement today. My name is Dave Brown, and in today's episode, we are joined by Patrick Breshears to talk about a strategy he uses to regain students' attention that he calls reintroduction. You've probably heard of redirections, which sometimes involves pausing a lesson to address or correct student behavior. In our conversation, Patrick talks about something he calls reintroduction, where rather than pausing an entire lesson, he goes with the flow and finds a way to include a distraction as part of the lesson. Listen to our conversation to learn more about this strategy that highlights how teaching is an art and a balancing act and requires improvisation and flexibility. All right, hello. We are here today with my old friend Patrick Breshears, who is a social studies teacher in North Carolina, and he's joining Cody and I today to talk about some just classroom management strategies, some basic things that really any teacher, I think, with at least a good enough rapport with their kids, could implement. So, Pat, if you want to either jump into your strategy or tell us a bit about yourself, why don't you kick us off?
So I'll just jump into the strategy. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said rapport. So, first and foremost with any classroom management strategy, going into the beginning of a semester, it begins with like building that relationship with the students. But and then from that foundation, you can find ways to not simply redirect students, which is typically the kind of term everyone likes to use in talking about basic classroom management, right? Redirect the students when they're not paying attention or when they're acting out or they're sleeping or something, go say something to them quietly and redirect them to get them back into the lesson. But I think if you have that foundation, that relationship as a foundation, instead of redirection, you can reconceptualize it to kind of a reintroduction. So you're not spinning them back into the lesson. Instead, you're taking what they have said or doing and including it and embedding it into the lesson. So reintroducing that student, making them an active partner in the conversation or the activity based on the thing or behavior you're trying to modify. So an example of that is oftentimes, in a lecture, students will, kind of doze away or zone out, or you'll have sidebar conversations. And so specifically with the sidebar conversations, it can be useful to, instead of telling them to be quiet, take what they're talking about and use it to exemplify or illustrate a concept in your lesson. So, for example, the other day we were talking about learning by association and operant conditioning. And I have a rule where you put your cell phones away in this drawer at the beginning of class. And a number of the students had not done it. And so
Sounds familiar.
instead of like, yelling at them, I was like, all right. I was like, you know, for today, if any since some students kept their cell phones, I'm going to give you a pop quiz. And so I gave them a pop quiz. It was not really a quiz. It was not ever going to be counted as a quiz. And then I used that as a hook to introduce the concept of operant conditioning, which is about applying reward and punishment to modify and manipulate behavior. And so it's just like looking for those kind of moments. If a kid has something smart, you got that kind of jokester, class clown, instead of like berating them, using that joke to make a point, right? Like including that or reintroducing that into the broader, concept of the lesson.
I was going to say, I really like the example you just gave was a little premeditated, I guess, because you had to have had probably the quiz on hand. Me
Well, I
hearing
made it
is
up.
what's that?
I just made it up off the top
Oh,
of.
really? Okay, what? You gave them questions, they had to write them down?
Yeah.
So it
I
sounds
didn't plan it out. It was just I saw that that I could use this misbehavior as a
yeah.
way.
Did you almost anticipate the misbehavior? Was it something that had been building for a few lessons and you were thinking about how to process that? Or was it sort of almost a spontaneous, impromptu idea that you had that you could then connect to the lesson?
Yeah, so actually I didn't realize that a third of the class had not put their cell phones away until about 10 or 15 minutes into the lesson. So I'd already introduced the question, done the hook, and was getting into like the lecture portion of the lesson. And then I saw some cell phones and I went and looked uh, and counted the cell phones in the drawer and then counted the kids and was like, hey, something's not adding up. All right. So you guys, this is what's gonna happen. I'm gonna pop quiz you. And then like it was like five questions. And then like the last question was like, will you put your cell phone in the drawer tomorrow without me asking? And they were, and
What was the
I imagine
effect?
they said yes. I
What
actually
was the
didn't even
effect of
look at the
this?
quizzes. So I just used it and then went into operant conditioning and
Hmm.
Have you seen, was this like literally yesterday or 2 days ago?
this
Have
was
you
two
been
days
able?
ago. And so for the next 2 days, I haven't not had to ask them to put
Oh,
their
okay.
I
So that's some
was
short-term results in a good way there.
yeah.
Well, and
So
something I was going to say, a couple quick connections. I feel like people who aren't in the teaching profession probably don't realize how many micro decisions teachers have to make. And so at first I was going to say it seems like you need to be very good at improving to do this, but actually I think in general to be a teacher you kind of have to be able to be so reflexive and reactive and improvisational because I heard this thing before. It's like teachers make the same amount, if not more, decisions as like surgeons during a day
yeah.
because you're dealing with maybe as a high school teacher 100 plus kids. They all have different questions and needs and behaviors. But what I like about what you did was no kid likes to be blamed or shamed or chastised, right? That or publicly humiliated.
Yeah.
So you have a way to, instead of completely stop and correct a behavior and be that annoying adult in the room, you did something that's actually memorable and you allow the kids to kind of save face and that you're not hurting the relationship by asserting some punishment on them. So I think that what you did is a great idea. I actually had a quick so, you even said, yeah, yours wasn't premeditated, but I was just thinking about reflecting, wow, I guess I've done this before too, because I just started with a new group of kids in a personal finance class. My first unit's all about behavioral finance and how before we even get into banks and interest rates and investments and all that stuff, we just talk about how the way people handle money is so much more psychological than it is um, logical, right? It's more emotional. And when we've been talking about different concepts, um, let's say like something called hedonic adaptation, which is this idea that people tend to return to a baseline level of happiness. So, for example, if you won the lottery or if you had a serious physical injury, in both cases, there will be an emotional spike, either one being good with the lottery, one being bad with the bad injury. But generally speaking, people kind of return to whatever their baseline is. If we're talking
Mhm.
happiness, it's that. Or if we talk behaviorally, like, if you're somebody who is a perpetual liar and you fix your ways for a month, you'll probably still hedonically adapt and go back to lying about everything all the time. And in class, I kind of connected that to a really cool sweatshirt that a kid was wearing and said something like, so and so bought this sweatshirt and maybe that made them feel happy, but then eventually that could be fleeting and they'll want to buy something again. But now this wasn't redirection, but I'm just thinking in general, again, this idea of like pulling stuff from the room. I'm trying to imagine if kids were having a conversation and if I overheard it and they were talking about like, let's say football, because a lot of my kids are talking about fantasy football. Maybe I could say something about like, we feel really elated after some sports win,
Right.
but then eventually you know, we kind of return to how we felt before. And this is a long-winded way to say, um, I like the idea of incorporating all that. Can you give any
Pat,
other like quick examples of how that's happened? I mean, I think the concept seems pretty clear, but if there's anything else to reinforce it, what else?
yeah, I was curious, like that was an example where there was a large group of students that was, doing the wrong thing, i.e. not putting the phones in the drawer. Can you tell us about a situation where it's more of an individual or a partnership thing, whether that's a student falling asleep or an individual student going way off task, and how you might try to read? What was the term you? It wasn't redirect. You said reintegrate, reintroduce.
Reintroduction. Yeah, so I mean, you guys know as teachers, there's a million examples happening all the time, but I think I'm gonna rather give a specific example, give just kind of a generalization that, we all face as teachers multiple times in a day. And that's the, the class clown, like the infamous class clown that distracts the whole class. Uh, they're not mean per se, or they don't have big outbursts, but it's just like a daily kind of like they always got the comment,
Yep.
and I think
Might have been me when I was a
reintroduction,
kid. Might have
yeah,
been me.
yeah, yeah. I think that's a lot of teachers, especially history teachers. But yeah, I think reintroduction is like the a great tool for specifically those type of situations or the football side conversations. Uh, because ultimately I think like with Dave, building on what you were saying and that idea in finance in general in life, right? Like the class clown is going to be the class clown, or you might be able to get them to slow down or stop every now and then, but they're always going to return back to that core personality trait of, where they use humor to engage, right?
Hmm.
Mhm.
So they're always going to go back to that, right? Uh, and so the, conceptualizing redirection as reintroduction allows that student to use, part of what makes them them within the class instead of outside of the boundaries
Mm.
of the class. Because you take their funny statement or you take their comment and you bring it into the lesson instead of saying it's not allowed, right? It has no place here, right? So you
What's cool
make
about
that
that
space
too,
alive.
I feel like by doing that, you're sort of indirectly saying to them, "Hey, let's get back focused," but you're actually meeting them
Right.
where they're at and sort of honoring them and who they are. And I think I would assume most, 90% of kids would probably get the hint and recognize. And then worst case scenario, if there's misbehavior that you can't handle is when you have a talk in the hallway or let it escalate beyond
Right.
that. But
Yeah, what I'm
yeah,
suggesting here is not like a replacement of establishing classroom norms.
right.
Like my cell phone example, that's a classroom norm I've had since the beginning of the year. It's, I'm trying to more argue that you can spend so much time redirecting behavior, because you think that these behaviors are not appropriate or allowed in the classroom. And reintroduction instead pivots away from that and says, no, there's more behaviors that can exist within the classroom and can be incorporated into, the task or the activities, just like the sidebar football conversation, right? That you
Well,
were
In
Pat,
You mentioned, Pat, in the beginning of the episode that you need to have that rapport with the students in order to effectively leverage your strategy. Are there, and I think that that's something that all teachers, I don't want to say struggle with, but have to deal with, right? The rapport that you have with your students. And, a lot of teachers have great rapport, and some teachers, unfortunately, have not so great rapport. Um, are there any things that you have done in your experience that help you build that rapport so that you can then do reintroduction more effectively, right? Because if a class doesn't like you as a teacher and a class is button heads against you, I kind of would hypothesize that anything that you try to do to to reintroduce is going to be met more with eye rolls and shrugging and sighs than it is of, oh, well, maybe teachers got something going on here.
Yeah, I think, students are like, they're people, and all human beings want to be shown grace. And so show your students grace. Like if you're having trouble building a relationship with individuals and then creating that class relationship, show grace. Like give a kid an extra day for an assignment, hand out some extra credit for something, do something to show them that you are the authority figure, but you are also an empathetic human being who has been a student and knows what it's like and can see it from the other side. Just step into their shoes a little bit, show some grace, and that's going to pay an extreme amount of dividends, right? Because then no matter what, if you build that relationship, and most strategies are going to be successful.
Right.
Because you have the relationship with them. You're not, they know that you are in the trenches with them.
Yeah.
Not on the back line sending orders to the trenches.
I think what you said that just really resonated with me is just to be empathetic, to share grace, that they're humans and you're a human, and try to, one, respect the fact that you are the authority figure as the teacher and they are the students. So there is that delineated line.
Yeah.
But take that away, right? You're just a person. One of the earlier episodes that we released on the podcast was me having conversations with students in the hall for the first 10 minutes of most class periods to try to, build that relationship. Dave does a great letter writing activity that we discussed in another episode. And so there's all these different, there's no panacea, there's no one size fits all cure, but I'm just thinking in my class, and my head's kind of spinning right now with, I'm thinking about this student who does this constantly and trying to figure out how I can apply that reintroduction philosophy versus the redirect. Like, hey, not eyes up here, but to try to incorporate that is something I'm looking forward to next week as we get into some of the harder times of the school year when it's getting dark earlier and it's cold and the novelty's starting to wear off.
Yeah. And I think, no strategy works universally.
Sure.
But I think the hardest thing for people to do in any industry is reconceptualize. And so, because a concept once introduced, normalized, and applied, tends to become dogmatic, and people are scared to move away from it, right? And that kind of closes down, your imagination and what is possible in a classroom. So again, I think reintroduction is not like a universally applicable, but it has space and a place where it can work.
It's certainly, at the very, very minimum, something that needs to be considered and tried as it applies to all of your classroom. Pat, we're really happy for you to come out with us today. We appreciate you sharing your ideas. I know, for one, I'm looking forward to implementing some of what you've discussed in my class, particularly with the fantasy football sidebar conversations. So thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Thank you for joining us on Authentic Educators, a podcast for teachers by teachers about best lessons, favorite classroom moments, and strategies you can use today. Have a great day.
Yeah, guys, it was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you again to our guest, Patrick. And if you enjoy what Cody and I are doing with Authentic Educators, please subscribe to our podcast and rate it on Spotify. And as always, if you have any questions or great ideas to share, reach out to us at authenticedpod@gmail.com.